until June this year, each month with a different mechanism or 2 different mechanisms like today. So this month we'll look into the interconnections between the SDGs and the Twin Covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Just a quick info about the Women's Major Group. Of course, our members already know this, but we have speakers from outside of the Women's Major Group who we're so happy to have with us today. The Women's Major Group is a global intersectional feminist collective that spreads throughout the world, and our primary mandate is to facilitate and support our members in their advocacy in the sustainable development processes, especially at the regional and global levels. So, and today our our accessibility coordinator is Andrea Vega Trancoso. You're welcome to write to her at any point if you have accessibility needs. And lastly, as you know, our meetings are open, these monthly meetings are open to our members only, but we do take recording and upload it on our YouTube channels and share it on the social media afterwards. So you'll see the recording blinking away. So without further ado, please allow me to give the floor to our North America organizing partner of the Women's Major Group, Spogmay Ahmed from the International Center for Research on Women. Spogmay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shanaz. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us. As the Women's Major Group with the SDGs and UN human rights mechanisms from a feminist perspective, we're aiming to do 3 things. So highlight the interplay between Agenda 2030 and the human rights mechanisms of the UN to support and enhance the implementation of the SDGs from a feminist and human rights-based perspective. We're also aiming to increase the knowledge and capacity of our members to interact with UN human rights mechanisms and to utilize the SDGs in their advocacy with these mechanisms. And lastly, we're aiming to introduce other rights-based organizations that are working on the intersection of gender equality and UN human rights mechanisms to our members who may also want to work on the interconnections between the SDGs and human rights. So this month we'll be talking about the Twin Covenants, Iccpr and ICE-SCR. After the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, the efforts to formulate it into legally binding treaties eventually resulted in the development and adoption of the Twin Covenants. So those are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or Iccpr, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or ICE-SCR. The Universal Declaration and the 2 covenants together form the International Bill of Human Rights. So the Twin Covenants are deeply important for our work as the Women's Major Group because of their extensive reach and their connection to the systemic and structural issues that we focus on. Without being able to exercise all of our human rights, without looking into economic and ecological justice, substantive gender equality cannot be achieved. So today we have a really great panel of speakers who will both talk about the Twin Covenants, but also their work and experiences in engaging with these mechanisms. In the second part of our meeting, we'll have a chance to discuss together how we can utilize the Twin Covenants, their context and their mechanisms for our advocacy on gender equality and system change within all the UN Sustainable Development mechanisms. So I'll first give the floor to Làzarie Eeckeloo, the Human Rights Officer of the Center for Civil and Political Rights. Làzarie is a human rights officer at the Center for Civil and Political Rights. In her work, she focuses on the link between corruption and human rights violations and the participation in public affairs. She works with civil society in Tunisia, Mauritania, and Kenya, and supports civil society organizations that engage with the Human Rights Committee and other UN human rights mechanisms. She holds a law degree from the KU Leuven and an LLM in International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights from the Geneva Academy. She previously worked at the Belgian representation of the European Commission in Brussels. So welcome, Làzarie, and thank you for joining us. Could you please give us a bit more information on the Iccpr and the work that the Center for Civil and Political Rights undertakes around it?
Hi, Spogmay, and hi to everyone that is in the meeting. Thank you for organizing this event. And I'll structure my reply in 3 parts. So I'll first say something about the CCPR as an organization, then something about the Human Rights Committee review process for those that might not be aware, and then something about how ICCPR and the SDGs are linked. And to start, so I'll talk a bit more about the organization. So we are an NGO based in Geneva, and our mission is worldwide full implementation of the ICCPR, which is an ambitious goal. But how do we do that concretely? Is we work with 3 main stakeholders. So the first one, and I think the most important one, is civil society, then government, and as last one, the Human Rights Committee itself, which is the monitoring body of the ICCPR. And what do we do with civil society organizations? We work with them at 3 moments in time. So before their state is reviewed by the Human Rights Committee, during and after. Before, we focus on capacity building and training them so that they are aware, that civil society is aware that something is happening in Geneva and how they can engage. And that is usually also preparing them to submit an alternative report, so that the Human Rights Committee receives also civil society information that they can take into account for the state review. During the review, we organize briefings for civil society with the members of the Human Rights Committee so they can voice their main concerns directly to them. And after the review, we focus on implementation and follow-up of the recommendations that are then published. And in that follow-up activity, we also include government, because obviously they are the key when we talk about implementation. I am simplifying a lot, but I'm just giving you a main picture and trying to stick within my 10 minutes. And in this work, we advocate for a holistic approach of the mechanisms, meaning there are several human rights mechanisms that are at disposal of civil society. There are the UN treaty bodies, which are in itself a collection of several mechanisms. There is the UPR, so the Universal Periodic Review. There are the special procedures, and there are also regional human rights mechanisms. And what we try to do is encourage civil society to use all of them, or at least the ones that are available to them, so that they reinforce each other and civil society's voice becomes even stronger. So that is a little bit about what the center does. I'll move now to the second part, so a little bit about this Human Rights Committee review process. Every state that has ratified the ICCPR has to be regularly reviewed by the Human Rights Committee, and currently 1 review cycle takes 8 years, which is a long time. So it is important for civil society to use the momentum of that review when it is taking place, because it just doesn't come along that often. What can you do then if your state is up for review? The most obvious way is to send in alternative reports, so participate in a written way. And in those reports, we recommend that you mention the link between SDGs and the covenant explicitly. I'll go into that later a little bit more. What you can also do is participate orally. So what I said before, we organize briefings between civil society and members of the Human Rights Committee. And in those briefings, again, you can mention your priorities. Then after the review, the Human Rights Committee adopts what we call concluding observations, which is a collection of recommendations addressed to the state. And if they implement those recommendations, they are better implementing the covenant, so the ICCPR. And I didn't check statistically, but in my experience, I think about 100% of all the concluding observations that the Human Rights Committee adopts have paragraphs about gender equality. It can be 1 paragraph about non-discrimination in general, but it's usually a lot broader than that, and it touches upon several aspects related to gender equality. I'll also go into that a little bit later on. And then about the implementation phase. So once these recommendations are published, it is really up to civil society to use these recommendations at the national level to push for more implementation. And what helps in that case is that the Human Rights Committee makes an explicit link between the SDGs and the ICCPR. Doesn't happen a lot though, but I'll talk about that later. And then again, since a review cycle is 8 years, there is a lot of time where there isn't a lot civil society can do in that mechanism, but we advocate for this holistic approach. So in the meantime, your state most likely has ratified other international treaties, so use the other treaty bodies. In 8 years, your state will go through at least 1, maybe 2 UPR cycles. So use these and make your message even stronger. So that's a little bit about the Human Rights Committee. And then a little bit more about the links between ICCPR and the SDGs. So the ICCPR, civil and political rights, those are typically rights where the state has to refrain from doing something in order to implement them. For example, don't torture your population, or don't interfere with the freedom of expression. And every right, so the ICCPR as a whole is a legally binding instrument for every state that has ratified it, while technically the SDGs are not. So in order to implement the SDGs, you can use existing monitoring and accountability systems like the UN treaty bodies to get a better implementation. But then how do you link the two? Well, a lot of SDGs seem to, at the first sight, have a very obvious link to economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to education, the right to health, employment, etc., are rights that are explicitly in the sister covenant of the ICCPR. So the link there is very, very obvious. But there are also many links with the ICCPR itself. You just have to dig a little deeper. And just to give you a few examples, if you talk about health and the SDG goal that is related to health, it is very closely linked to the right to life. And the right to life is guaranteed in Article 6 of the ICCPR. So that's a first example. Gender equality, the goal that I think is relevant for a lot of you today, is very closely linked to Article 3 of the ICCPR, which prohibits discrimination between men and women. Another example would be employment. There is a very clear link between employment and Article 8 of the ICCPR, which prohibits slavery and forced labor, for example. And a last example, but there are obviously many, many more, climate change is also very closely linked to the right to life. So the links are there. They might be slightly less clear than with the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but they are there and they're not that difficult to find. However, we see very little of these connections in the current work of the Human Rights Committee, unfortunately. I did a word search. On the website Universal Human Rights Index, which is a database from the UN, it contains all the concluding observations of all treaty bodies. And I did a word search focusing on only the concluding observations adopted by the Human Rights Committee between 2015 and 2020, looking for Agenda 2030, SDGs, Sustainable Development. And there is only one reference to it that is explicit in those 5 years, and that is a recommendation from 2016 to New Zealand, where it recommends New Zealand, among other recommendations, to develop programs for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 5 to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, with a particular focus on Maori and Pacifica women and girls, as well as women and girls with disabilities. So that is one of the recommendations that New Zealand got in relation to gender equality in 2016, but no specific other references were made in those 5 years, while I did the same search for the sister committee, so the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and they have 30 explicit references to the SDGs. Why is there such a gap? I don't know all the answers, but I think it has to do with two things. The first one is what I mentioned, that the link with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is just clearer and more explicit. But it also has to do with the fact that civil society should report about the explicit link between the covenant and the SDGs. The committee can only make recommendations about issues they receive information about. So it definitely helps that civil society mentions specific links in their reporting. How can you do that? As an example, as I said, SDG Goal 5 on gender equality is very closely linked to Article 3 on non-discrimination, but it also has a lot of other links. For example, Article 7 of the Iccpr prohibits torture, which you can then link to violence against women and girls. There is also Article 25 of the Iccpr, which is the participation in public affairs. That's also very closely linked to SDG Goal 5. Article 17, which protects the privacy, you can relate that to sexual and reproductive health, which is an aspect of SDG Goal 5. Same with Article 19, which guarantees the freedom of expression, which you can then link to communication technology and the empowerment of women and girls. And there are obviously many more links to it. I just wanted to give a first impression how clearly all these rights are linked together. And our main message is that when there is more harmony between the approaches, so the SDG approach and the human rights approach, it makes it easier for governments to implement everything. And not only that, it makes it also easier for civil society to interact with the mechanisms. If there is more collaboration between them, there is probably more coherence between them, and this will also enhance the accountability of states towards implementation. So this is where I'll end my response. I'll obviously be available for questions afterwards, and I'll give the floor back to you, Spogmay.
Thanks so much, Làzarie. That was a really helpful overview of different mechanisms and guidance on how best to link the SDGs with these other mechanisms. So I just want to remind everybody that there is translation available. If anybody would like to listen in Spanish or French, you just click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screens. And if anybody has questions as we go along, please feel free to throw them into the chat and we'll compile them at the end and visit the questions that have been raised. So now I'm going to move on to our next speaker. We'll look into the use of Iccpr as an advocacy tool. So Kseniya Kirichenko from the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, or ILGA, will talk to us about their experiences working with the Iccpr mechanism. So Kseniya is a feminist activist, international human rights lawyer, and legal researcher with 10 years of experience in academia and 15 years of practice in public interest advocacy, strategic litigation, and human rights project management at national and international levels. She holds a law degree from Novosibirsk State University and completed her PhD studies there doing comparative legal research on reproductive donorship and surrogacy. She was also a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School in New York City and an international fellow with the Global Network for Public Interest Law. Kseniya joined ILGA World in 2016 and leads and coordinates activities on UN treaty bodies, special procedures, women in training. Apart from LGBTI human rights, she has also worked on women's rights, sex workers' rights, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Currently, Kseniya also serves as the board member of the Euro-Central Asian Lesbian Community. Kseniya, welcome. We're so happy to have you with us today. Could you talk to us a bit about your experiences with the Iccpr committee and how this advocacy supported your work?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's really my great pleasure and honor to be here because, well, obviously, ILGA World, it's an organization which is working on LGBTI rights, but we see, of course, that there is let's say, genetic connection with the women and feminist movement, because intersectionality is one of our main principles. And when we talk about intersectionality, it's not only about identities themselves, but also about system of oppression such as patriarchy, misogyny, and of course, that's like our shared agenda. Like structure of our organization is organized so that, for example, I work specifically on treaty bodies and special procedures, and also CSW. So it's more like based on mechanisms. And currently we don't have anyone specifically working on SDGs, even though we want to do more work on this in relation to LGBTI human rights. But I would like to share with you some of our experience in relation to the Iccpr and the Human Rights Committee. So because we have not like a mechanism or a convention-based focus, but rather a community-based focus. So we are working on LGBTI human rights. And through this, we are using different mechanisms and different conventions, including Iccpr and the Human Rights Committee. And from this perspective, I work with grassroots local defenders from all over the globe, and we are helping them in engaging with the UN mechanisms. So I specifically worked with the Human Rights Committee, and we were looking into how to use the Iccpr framework to advance LGBTI human rights. And I think one of the lessons from our work, and it can be applied not only to the Iccpr, but also SDGs, and not only to LGBTI persons, but any intersectional communities of women, is that when we do not see an explicit reference to, for example, LGBTI people, or let's say sex workers, or maybe indigenous women sometimes, it doesn't mean that we should stop working with these mechanisms, because the key thing is interpretation and living interpretation of the conventions, but also SDGs. So for example, there is no reference to LGBTI human rights in the convention, in the Iccpr covenant, as well as in SDGs. But in both cases, we've seen that practice and interpretation of these mechanisms developed to include LGBTI persons' rights, and specifically LGBTI women's rights. So one thing is that even though sometimes maybe you will not find specific articles about your community or population, you can, through civil society participation and through providing your data, you can actually develop the approach to interpretation of these articles, and it's for both Iccpr and SDGs. The other thing is also I did some research on recommendations from the Iccpr, but also other treaty bodies and other conventions. And because we are collecting recommendations specifically on LGBTI human rights, I was looking not only on the Iccpr, but LGBTI recommendations from different committees. And what I found out was that there were indeed no references to LGBTI recommendations in connection to SDGs from the Human Rights Committee, but there were quite a lot of references from other committees, other treaty bodies, such as CEDAW specifically, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. But what I think is that, indeed, as my colleague mentioned, is that you can actually use the approaches under the SDGs to include them into other covenants, specifically the Iccpr. Because, for example, what CEDAW did on LGBTI rights and SDGs was in relation to SDG 5 about women, and it was, for example, 5.1 on discrimination against women, and there were recommendations on anti-discrimination legislation and the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity into the list of protected grounds. There were recommendations also by CEDAW in relation to SDG 5.5 5.1 when it comes to change of documents by trans people, also training for judges and police on violence against LGBTI women. So all these things, they could be also raised, of course, under the Iccpr and under the reviews, country reviews of Human Rights Committee. Also, I found references to SDG 5 in relation to violence against women, and both violence or harassment from the police in relation to sex workers and sexual minority women. Also 5.3, it's about harmful practices. And for us, the most important thing, one of the most important things here is intersex genital mutilation, for instance, which is could be framed under harmful practices. And of course, we can, the Human Rights Committee already talked about harmful practices, intersex genital mutilation, training for police when it comes to intersectional forms of violence. And the only thing we can do here is to connect SDGs, relevant SDGs, with the convention or general discourse of the Human Rights Committee. Another example is SDG 16, which is about children, the rights of the child, or children, the situation of children. And also the Committee on the Rights of the Child made also recommendation on intersex children and medical interventions towards intersex children in the context of access to justice for children. So access to justice is also, of course, an aspect which could be described under the Iccpr. So that's just like a very brief analysis of recommendations. And I think that indeed there are a lot of opportunities to connect SDGs with the Iccpr. And my last point here would be that generally, when I think about advocacy and especially grassroots activists or national organizations who are working on human rights advocacy, women's advocacy, I think that one of the most important things is to think about system of advocacy. Because yes, you can engage with the Human Rights Committee, with CEDAW committee, with SDGs, but at the end, I think that for local defenders, what is important is to change the living realities of women, for example, who are, facing different challenges in their country. And it's not that important what exact mechanism will be there and from which committee you will receive recommendation, but the implementation of this recommendation. And I think that it can be a very good and effective strategy when you identify your priority. For example, like in my home country, Russia, we still do not have a law on domestic violence. And then you can just identify this priority and collect data, but then to go with this data and with this priority to different mechanisms, to go to the Human Rights Committee, to go to the high-level political forum to speak about SDGs, and then to go to CEDAW. And then when you will have recommendations from different mechanisms, it will just give you additional tools to support your advocacy, but also to do it in a systemic way. And also from our experience, because I don't know, maybe your organization is a bit different, but for us, many local defenders, many of them are just volunteers, some of them are not lawyers, and they have always limited resources. So it would be difficult for them to, to organize a comprehensive data collection campaign for each of the mechanisms. And therefore, the key strategy here is recycling. We call it recycling. So you just have your draft report, which you can actually adopt for the needs of different mechanisms. And you don't have to write reports every time from the beginning. If you have something already submitted on SDGs, you can basically take this text and just shift it for the needs of the Human Rights Committee, and then to send this information to this committee and ideally receive recommendations. So that's kind of my few points. And I hope that in the future we will work more on SDGs, and maybe then I will be able to share with you more concrete examples.
Thanks, Kseniya, for sharing your experiences and really helpful analysis. So we're now going to get into the second covenant, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So first up will be Valentine Sébile from the ESCR-Net, the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, will introduce us to the Covenant and the work of the network through it. So Valentine is the coordinator of the Women in ESCR Working Group. Prior to joining ESCR-Net, she worked on issues related to human rights activism and collective mobilization, particularly in Chile, France, and Francophone countries. Between 2015 and 2020, she was the advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Valentine holds a BA in political science with a specialization in comparative politics in Latin America and a master in gender studies. So Valentine, once again, welcome. Could you share with us some information on ICESCR? Which aspects do you use the most as ESCR-Net, and what support do you provide to your members and how you work together?
Thank you, Spogmay, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today, and I want to thank Shanaz and the Women's Major Group for this invitation. So I will briefly present ESCR-Net and how, as a global network, we have been advocating for the adoption and implementation of international governance to realize ESG rights. And I will let Alejandra and Charlene, two active members of the working group I'll coordinate, explain how they have been engaging with the international governance on economic, social, and cultural rights, and how our work can be linked to the SDGs. So perhaps if you have questions, maybe we could regroup them after Charlene's presentation. So let me start introducing ESCR-Net. So it's a global network of over 270 members from 75 countries. So including grassroots groups, social movements, NGOs, academic centers, and advocates. So it's a collaborative initiative of groups and individuals working to secure economic and social justice through human rights. And the members share the following objectives. So they advocate shared and alternatives to the dominant socio-economic model, grounded in an inclusive vision for realizing human rights and environmental justice. Center ESGR in public debates, decision-making, structures and practices. Secure justice for systemic ESCR violations, pursuing effective accountability, regulation, remedies, and implementation through participatory approaches. Counter growing repression, reinforcing the credibility and capacity of human rights defenders and connecting reprisals to underlying ESCR issues. Strengthen connections between diverse struggles, challenging common global conditions, and foregrounding the analysis and leadership of social movements, and operationalize an intersectional approach in practice, foregrounding gender analysis and guided by communities. 4 core principles permeate the entire action of the network. Advancing all human rights as universal, indivisible, and interdependent, with a focus on ESCR issues, ensuring regional and gender balance in leadership, intersectional feminist analysis, and the centrality of grassroots groups and social movements. As a network, we always try to prioritize demands from social movements, grounding network activities in the lived experiences of people resisting ESCR violations and advancing concrete collective actions able to affect systemic change, and striving for shared analysis and consensus in decision-making as a member-led network, but respecting the autonomy of individual participants' positions. The network is currently organized around different programs, such as the Women and ESG Rights I coordinate. There's a program on corporate accountability, economic policy, strategic litigation, monitoring, the system of solidarity, and climate justice. Regarding the Women and ESCR Working Group, it seeks to advance substantive equality at the intersection of women's rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, and collectively strives to ensure that the demands of grassroots women leaders and feminist visions are at the center of policy making, legal developments, and systemic alternatives. Over the past years, the working group has been focusing on two main axes. One is women and work, and the other one is relates to women, land, housing, and natural resources. Regarding the Women and Work project, the working group identified a few priorities areas, including recognition of and remuneration for unpaid domestic and care work, the gender pay gap and the need for a common living wage, workplace violence against women, and the prevailing neoliberal economic model that affects women's rights to and at work. Recently, the working group has been amplifying local struggles and key global demands through the Women's Global Strike. It has been developing a global social pact on care based on the collective analysis on care work and all its implication on women's rights. And it has contributed to strategic litigation initiatives, such as the Marcia Trujillo versus Ecuador case that Charlene will speak about. Through our projects related to women, land, housing, and natural resources, the working group has also been collaborating on strategic litigation cases, and members have collectively worked with the monitoring working group on the Altavoz project to support grassroots groups, communities, and NGOs to bring their issues to the attention of United Nations bodies through parallel reporting and increase government accountability to human rights obligations. So through parallel reporting, civil society organizations and movement can take an active role in holding states accountable to their legally mandated obligations. And parallel reporting can amplify the voices of groups whose rights are being violated, and it can strengthen the visibility of issues that otherwise might not get adequate attention. More broadly, across the network, members had been advocating for a new general comments by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that would provide further guidance to states regarding the human rights obligation related to land. And previously, ESCR-Net members advocated for and offered input into CEDAW General Recommendation number 34 on the rights of rural women. And as you know, the International Covenant, the Iccpr, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, are two key human rights instruments which provide a forum for demanding realizations of women's human rights. In 2013, the ESCR-Net, in conjunction with the Euro Asia Pacific, published a practical guide to using both CEDAW and Iccpr, as well as their complaint mechanisms to demand recognition and implementation of women's ESG rights. The last point I want to raise relates to complaint mechanisms, but Alejandra will also speak about that. The procedures they provide for can include individual communication, an inquiry procedure, and then an interstate procedure. There are procedures for complaints which fall outside the treaty body system through the special procedures under the Human Rights Council complaint procedures and through the Commission on the Status of Women. Both of these treaties, so the Iccpr and CEDAW, have optional protocols which can be used to enhance the normative and accountability framework for women's ESG rights. And there are several benefits that optional protocols can provide for the implementation of women ESG rights and redress for violation of women's ESCR rights. In the manual I just mentioned, you can find some of the information I'm about to mention. So those benefits could include creating an accountability mechanism at the international level for a state's failure to meet its obligation under the convention, affording individuals and groups of women the possibility of an effective remedy where none was available at the national level, identifying specific law and policy reforms that must be undertaken by a state which has breached its obligation under the conventions, building jurisprudence that can influence decision-making in national courts and by other human rights bodies, clarifying the scope and content of the provisions of the convention in the context of a specific factual situation, so that all state parties have more detailed guidance as to their obligation. Creating opportunities for targeted capacity building on advocacy and litigation on women's ESCR rights. Providing a focus for campaigning by national groups on particular issues through ratification campaigns or advocacy to promote implementation of the CEDAW and CESCAS committees' concluding observations and recommendations. And finally, encouraging strategic alliances among groups in civil societies to support optional protocol-related activities, including ratification, submission of communications, and inquiries. So I don't want to take too much time. I want to leave enough time to Alejandra and Charlene to go into more details on their experiences engaging with these mechanisms and on the link with the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights and also recommendations. So I'm going to pass it on to two members of the ESCR-Net. That's Alejandra Lozano and Charlene May, who will be sharing how they're using the ICE-SCR in their work for the elimination of intersectional discrimination facing women and girls. So Alejandra is currently working as a program officer on women's rights and gender equality at the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. She's an international lawyer working on the intersections between international human rights, environmental, and economic law from a gender perspective. She previously worked as Deputy Head of Section of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico and as a consultant to the United Nations Development Program in the fields of education and sustainable development. She holds a Master of Law from the University of Cambridge as a Schevening and Cambridge Trust Scholar, as well as a Bachelor of Law from the Universidad Nacional Autonomía in Mexico. And Alejandra is based in Mexico City. Alejandra, welcome. We're really happy that you can join us. Can you please share with us how you use ICE-SCR towards advocacy in your work and what opportunities it provides for your work on gender equality?
Thank you so much for that introduction. And first, let me say once again, and thank you for the women's major group for creating this space. That certainly it is key and essential for us to learn, to strategize, and to exchange information on these key topics. So let me first start by saying that I believe that most of the challenges resulting from structural gender inequality that we are facing today are exactly related and connected to the failure of states in advancing ESCR rights and the SDG framework. For instance, what we are seeing right now as the impacts of the COVID pandemic and the intersecting environmental and inequality crisis are often related to this failure of states in advancing these critical frameworks. We also cannot forget that women are at the front lines of ESCR rights and environmental advocacy, and that they are particularly targeted in these roles of human rights defenders. So I think it is important to start by saying that there is no aspect of ESCR rights or the SDG frameworks that are not relevant to the lives of women, or which is not directly or indirectly impacted by the discrimination on the basis of gender, whether it relates to questions of health, work, social security, or environmental protection. So I will not specifically explain how the treaty body mechanisms work and the interrelations of the SDGs and the International Covenant on the Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, because Valentine already has very thoroughly have done so. But let me just say that national and international ESCR right monitoring and accountability bodies, such as the Committee on ESCR Rights, can and effectively do bolster women's and women's rights organizations' demand by exposing and seeking accountability for these conditions of structural gender inequality. And in this regard, I invite participants, and I will share right now in a moment, a link to a report recently published by the Global Initiative, which, in addition to explaining in depth the relevance of these ESCR rights framework to advance gender equality, it as well compiles most of the human rights standard issued by the Committee on Economic and Social Cultural Rights on each one of the rights contained in the treaty. And as well, it provides, as of course Charlene will also explain, key examples and case studies of several women's rights organizations who have used this international covenant, this treaty, to redress women's rights violations and to frame advocacy strategies and campaigns. So I will share this link in the chat now, and I hope this resource can help everyone, all of the participants, to keep informing this debate and this discussion. And I will center more substantively to provide a few general reflections more on the importance of civil society engagement with the covenant, and as well as human rights, international human rights mechanisms to achieve transformative change. So first of all, I think it is essential for us to continue to amplify the voices of women and to foster women's meaningful participation in international human rights mechanisms. We need to influence the work and outputs, including in norm development, in order to ensure that these standards do reflect and are responsive to the experiences and demands of women human rights defender and local feminist struggles. These outputs can, and as we will, as you will see in this report, and as my next speaker will explain, do play a key role in changing laws, policies, and global rights narratives. So in this sense, for instance, the Global Initiative has sought to provide information, tools, and guidance to help empower local women's rights organizations and right holders to participate and take action on their own behalf in these key decision-making spaces. Secondly, I believe, and it is important to state as well, that this covenant and this treaty and engaging with human rights treaty mechanisms and bodies, such as the reporting procedure, can allow for the development of a shared agenda in a coalition of civil society organizations. As already other speakers have said, crafting parallel reports is a highly effective means to reach out to other organizations, to exchange information, to learn, and most importantly, to strengthen partnerships and networks that can later as well serve as platforms to build cross-constituency movements. So these exercises are above all a very effective means to break organizational silos and to contribute to the development of a common global rights narrative that is important to keep on advancing the realization of women's rights and gender equality. Thirdly, I will also like to underscore that it is essential for us to strive to advance new frontiers in ESCR rights at the international level. Of course, and as we have already mentioned, there is a rich body of standards that have already been articulated, but there is a room to build more on these achievements. And there are many ways in which we can see connections between ESCR rights and gender equality, and these can be further strengthened using the treaty. For example, there is room to elaborate further upon the ways in which women are impacted by tax policy, uneven care system, climate change, and the just transition to low carbon economy and to renewable energies, just to say a few examples. And we need to be, as women rights organizations, we need to be responsive to the emerging themes relevant to women's ESCR rights. And finally, I would like to share that as well, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, there is a real risk for civil society engagement with these human rights mechanisms to be sacrificed in the move to virtual meetings. So this is something that we cannot lose sight of. It is important to ensure that our advocacy in these international spaces do ensure modalities for virtual meetings or online meetings that are inclusive and that they are accessible and that they can be strengthened to ensure that they are responsive to local struggles and the demands on women's rights and human rights defenders. So these are just a few key insights and examples that I wanted to share, some lessons learned from our advocacy that we have done with treaty borders and other international human rights mechanisms. And I leave it there, and I will pass the floor to Charlene to continue with our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alejandra, for those insights and also pointing out the effects of the pandemic and how we need to really adapt our ways of working there. So we're going to turn to Charlene for her to share with us how she used the SDGs and the ICE-SCR in litigation before domestic courts in South Africa. So Charlene is a South African attorney who has spent the better part of 14 years practicing in the area of public interest litigation with a specific focus on access to socioeconomic rights realization. She has experience litigating the right to custom for women in the instance where their rights to housing, land, and property rights were tied to their marriages, which took place in accordance with customary law. Additionally, she's been involved in a number of cases dealing with the right to land and housing, representing communities facing eviction, as well as land restitution for communities that lost their land as a result of forced removals. Welcome, Charlene, and thank you for being with us today. We know that you've done a lot of incredible work in collaboration with the ESCR-Net in South Africa on the rights of domestic workers, as well as on the extension of social security protection for the unpaid care work undertaken by women in South Africa. Could you talk to us about how you've utilized the SDGs and ICE-SCR in these processes?
Thank you so much. I realize that I'm going at the tail end of this conversation, so I'm going to try and hopefully keep it interesting. So as you pointed out, I work for an organization called the Women's Legal Center, and we're based in Cape Town in South Africa. And what we really do is public interest litigation. And what we try and seek to do is to bring substantive equality for women living in South Africa through utilizing South African courts, advocacy, and doing education and training. We really apply an intersectional feminist lens to the law and to policy, and to try and see how we can use that intersectional lens, that feminist lens, to impact the lived realities of women. If I can start off just within that South African context, talking about the SDGs, they haven't really played a significant or very visible role within South African law or within policy development. And I think that that's probably something that's come out of this discussion, is that the SDGs within our country context is not necessarily visible. But where we have found it to be very useful is within the context of other international laws. And I think that one of the other speakers talked and reflected on this a little bit earlier on in the conversation, to say that there's a number of international mechanisms, and to some extent they overlap with each other, and where they do, it's really useful because you can use as many of them as possible in order to bring your point across. And so how we've really used it within a domestic litigation forum has really been to use it in conjunction with our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, which already makes provision for the recognition of economic, social, and cultural rights. And so that makes it a little bit easier for us to bring cases before courts for litigation. And I know that lots of people in other countries and women's groups in other countries don't necessarily have the benefit of having the economic, cultural rights entrenched within their constitutions. But just to reflect a little bit on how we've used it in practical ways in litigation, perhaps is to talk about a case that judgment was handed down by our Constitutional Court in December of last year. And it's the case of a domestic worker called Sylvia Mshlangu. And she had passed away in a horrific accident. She drowned in her employer's swimming pool. And her family then wanted to claim social security benefits in terms of our occupational health and safety legislation. But they weren't allowed to do that because that piece of legislation specifically excludes domestic workers from being able to contribute to that fund, but also for them to be able to benefit from the fund. And so effectively, that means that an entire category of women who provide work, and as the Constitutional Court said, provides work that forms the backbone of our country and the backbone of our economy in many ways, that this entire category of women were excluded from benefiting in any way from socioeconomic rights protection in the form of social security. And so what we did as the Women's Legal Center is that we came into the case as what we called a friend of the court. And we put before the court a really gendered and feminist lens to be able to say to the court that in order for you to consider whether domestic workers should be considered as a class or a category of worker that should be included in occupational health and safety, social security benefit, in order for you to do that, you really need to look at why they were excluded in the first place. And I don't think I need to talk a lot about South Africa's history of apartheid and how in many ways Black women were prohibited or excluded from the formal economy. They weren't allowed to take up work or choose professions of their choice. And so in most instances, many instances, women, Black African women took up domestic work as a means of providing for themselves and their families financially. And it was within this classification of this work as being work done by a lesser category or class of persons, the work that is done by women. And so the case fell within that intersection of discrimination that women experience, that women of a particular race experience, but also that women of a particular class experience. And this is what we managed to put before the court. And where we really brought in the Sustainable Development Goals was to say that South Africa is a signatory and has signed on to this commitment to achieving the SDGs. But more importantly, they've signed on and they've made this commitment to eradicate poverty in the country. And if we exclude purposefully a category or group of workers from enjoying social security protection, then in essence, what we are doing is that we are trapping that category of women within poverty, within the cycle of poverty that will continue to perpetuate through generations and that will continue to impact on this class or category of African Black women within South Africa. And what was really heartening for us is that the court really took to the arguments around the intersectionality and the need for substantive equality, but that the court also adopted this intersectional feminist lens. And what's been quite unique for us is that our constitutional court talked about feminism and talked about intersectionality. So it's a wonderful judgment. And I think an example of how you can use the SDGs, but you can also use economic, social, cultural rights and those international or regional obligations. You can use them in litigation in order to extend on the rights that you have available in your country already. Valentina talked a little bit about the Trujillo matter, which is really a case that we did as part of the ESCR-Net. It was a collaboration between our women's working group and our strategic litigation focus group. And what the case in essence dealt with social security benefits in Ecuador for women who perform unpaid care work. And in this instance, we were talking about work that the majority of women perform at some point in their life, whether it's after having given birth or giving birth to children, raising children, having to take time off from work in order to do that, but also that time period where women might be required to care for their families, care for the elderly, care for the sick within their community. So that unpaid care work that's not formally recognized as work, that women are not compensated for. And that because women largely carry the burden of that unpaid care work, they are unable during that time period to contribute to any formal social security scheme that countries might have available. And so in this case, that's exactly what happened. This woman took time off during her employment period in order for her to care for her children. During those time periods, she was unable to contribute towards the social security scheme in Ecuador. And so when it came time for her to benefit from social security when she had to take, when she retired and took her pension, She was then advised that she no longer qualifies for that because she had this large gaps in between her formal working time, right? And that's the case that then ended up before the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and that's in terms of the optional protocol that was referenced by Ali while she was talking. And what ESCR-Net did as a network is that it intervened in what's called a third-party intervention. It is a little bit like a friend of the court within our domestic court systems. And it's coming in as an independent third party to be able to say, we have some knowledge that might be able to help the committee in making a determination on this case. And what we really put forward to the court was all of these arguments around how, in order to realize economic, social, cultural rights, we have to address the discrimination that often lies in domestic laws and domestic policies. And that this was such a key, but also a clear-cut case, right, of how unpaid care work is overlooked because it's women's work, and how women are then excluded from the benefits or the rights that they would automatically be entitled to. And so this is some of the arguments that we were able to put before the committee, utilizing the mechanism that is available under the covenant and under the optional protocol, but also being able to remind the committee of those pronouncements, those general recommendations that they'd made in the past around women, around the right to work, around just and favorable conditions of work. And I think that it's often useful for us, I think one of the speakers said it earlier on, it's often useful for us to go back and look at what pronouncements were made previously in order to refresh the memory of committee members, because they sit there on a rotational basis. And to be able to say that you've already made pronouncements around certain things. And so here is a case for you, or a case that's coming before you, where your previous comments, your previous recommendations that's really given normative content to rights can come in and assist you in making a determination on a case that is before you. Yeah, so I think that these are two examples around the right to work, and the right to recognition of work, but also the right to social security benefits. So it's two examples, one playing out at kind of a national domestic level, but also one playing out at an international level where international mechanisms and the covenant has been used quite successfully in order to advance women's rights. So I'm going to pause there and then I'll deal with anything in the question session if there is. But thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Charlene, for sharing your experiences. And thank you all. This has been a really enriching and inspiring discussion, and it's been valuable to get all of your experiences on this work. And thank you also for doing this work. So we're going to now open the floor to questions from our participants, and then we also have some discussion questions that we can go to. So if you have any questions and would like to throw them in the chat, this is the time to do so, and we can move forward from there. So please throw us your questions, and if not, we'll move to these two discussion points. I'm not seeing much from my end, so maybe we can start with the first discussion question. So how can we connect the VNR process to the review processes of the Twin Covenants more effectively? Anybody, any of the panelists or anybody from the Women's Major Group want to share their perspectives on the VNRs and potentially linking with the Twin Covenants? Yeah, I think you can speak in Spanish. Or Andrea, do you want to guide on the interpretation piece once more? Or Shanaz?
If everybody speaks English, I could try.
And if I don't find the words, I speak middle and middle. Okay.
Sorry, that's okay, Maria Jose. As long as everyone who wants to listen in English is in the English channel, where you find the globe at the bottom of your screen. If you select English there, we'll all hear Maria Jose in English, and then she can ask her question in Spanish.
Okay. No, yo estuve hace muchos años involucrada a través de WIDO. Hacíamos un interesante trabajo de seguimiento de los tratados internacionales en materia de derechos humanos y una articulación muy fuerte del movimiento de mujeres global, también con el Center for Women's Global Leadership. En esa época, por supuesto, no existían los ODS, pero a mí me parece que deberíamos volver a establecer una agenda que nos permita establecer las fechas.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you go to the Spanish channel so we can hear? No, that's okay. Okay. So we can hear the English more clearly and you can hear the Spanish.
¿Ahora está bien? ¿Ahora está bien?
I think you're still in the English channel. Can you go to the Spanish channel?
Estoy en el español.
Okay. Sorry, don't know why it's not.
Sí, te escucho perfectamente. Estoy en el español. Si no voy al inglés y trato de hablar en inglés.
Okay, we can, I think we can just continue as you want. Maybe our translator can try to speak in a louder voice, and I'm sorry, I don't know why it's not doing what it should.
Ahora estoy hablando en español en el canal español, ¿no? Okay. Okay, I return in English. Okay. I was saying that many years ago, I was part of the human rights movement coordinated by the WIDO and the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and we were monitoring all the treaties, and they do a huge work trying to reach all the countries with the processes following the treaties, the compliant treaties. But now with the CDGs, there are movements in parallel, and it's very important to connect the treaties with the CDGs, because many countries forget their compliance in order only to have these processes, these soft processes. And I think that we could organize something more permanent in the reviewing of the treaties, linking with the CDGs. If there is a sort of coordination between regions, we could present not only the shadow reports to the treaties, but also to the BNARDs, and try to do it together with some kind of orientation or guidance of the different experts in the different regions. That's all. It's a proposal, not a question, to do a more systematic work together. Do you understand in English or Spanish or something?
Yes, thank you. Does anybody want to follow up on that or add to the discussion there?
Yeah, I would like to say something if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that is a very good proposal, and I would really encourage civil society organizations to start doing that, even if there is no formal framework at this point, where SDGs evaluation is formally included in a treaty review process. As I said, like included in the reports. We've seen a similar sort of dynamic in our thematic work, so that the center also has a project on the link between corruption and human rights. And we saw a similar kind of idea that anti-corruption experts in a lot of countries are completely separated from the human rights activists, and there is no link between the two, while the two are so closely connected. And it's important that anti-corruption experts use the human rights mechanisms, but also the human rights experts should use the anti-corruption mechanisms. And I feel like it's a little bit of the same dynamic with SDGs and human rights. And I think, as you said in your proposal before, there is even a formal framework. I think the first movement or the first step can already be taken by NGOs at this point. So thank you.
Anybody else want to add, or feel free to just jump in if you have comments, and we can try the interpretation once more if anybody feels more comfortable giving their comments in Spanish or French.
This is Marta. I am in El Salvador. I have placed a comment in the chat box, and I won't take that much time, but it is good that you are doing this process of really discernment on where we are and how we come here and where we need to go. And we need to really deepen it much more, because we got to really read the signs of the times. A new world order is being created as we chat here, because there is a way that people are watching, you know, in the context of going to Mars, more or less, and not staying seriously and on purpose, fit for purpose here on Earth. So I just wanted to let you know that I am very glad of this. I'm one of the few people that still very participatory in the process here. And, you know, we started with WIDU before 1990, and we created this process that now really is relevant as much as we deepen it and amplify it and transcend it, because women must have a say on how the world order has to be created so that we can live in peace with each other, with ourselves, in the community of nations, and with the planet. This is the purpose of all these discussions and all the work that we are doing. And thank you very much. This is Marta from El Salvador, siglo XXIII. Bye.
Thank you, Marta, and appreciate your comment about linking to other frameworks and resolutions that we've seen come out of the UN as well. It's valuable to remember in this conversation. Anybody else have comments? If not, I can move along to the second discussion question. So as the Women's Major Group, how can we support our members in strengthening the bridge between SDGs and human rights advocacy around the Twin Covenants? So we've had some useful recommendations already, and it'd be valuable to hear from you all on how you think the Women's Major Group can help amplify this. And we also have a comment from Maria Jose, noting that NGOs have done a linkage guide between, asking if any NGOs have done a linkage guide between the SDGs and all the treaties describing the connections. If anybody has done this sort of work in your organizations, now's a good time to share any resources on this work.
This is not something that my organizations was in any way involved in, but what I used in order to prepare for this meeting today, there is a website where you can, so they list up all the SDGs, and then you can fill in an international treaty or any other international instrument, and then it shows you which article is corresponding to which SDG. I'll put the website in the chat. I think it's pretty useful.
Awesome, that sounds great. I also have a question directed to Charlene from Cecilia Mena, asking if you could give more details on the case of Ecuador.
More power to deploy across all the week. So let's see how it goes.
I do that now. I have replied in the chat, Spogmay. I've replied in the chat with a link to the ESCR-Net's website that also has links in there that takes people to the actual judgment that was handed down, as well as to the submissions that we made to the committee. Yeah, so all of that information can be found on the website in a lot more detail.
Awesome, thank you.
Also, just to respond perhaps to the previous question around just places where people have kind of drawn information together in terms of the covenants. I think not necessarily just on the covenants, but ESCR-Net again on the website has 3 briefing papers, one on women's right to health care, one on women in work, and one on women in land, where it does a comparison really of recommendations that have been made by the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and then also what the CEDAW committee, for instance, have said around those particular rights and making the linkages and kind of helping to make arguments. So that might be useful for people just to take a look at.
Great, thank you for pointing that out. I also have a raised hand from Navi Sarbona. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing, but feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to comment. Or feel free to add any comments in the chat if that's easier. We can wait a bit, I think, but anybody else have questions or comments? We have about...
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's better. Go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Tracy. I'm calling from Nigeria. And I wanted to know how the Women's Major Group can help to strengthen national dialogues around the 2 issues that we are discussing. Because most times we're not able to hold the government accountable. Therefore, we can't see the SDGs succeed in our country. So for me, I want to see how, for instance, Nigeria can have perhaps a group of CSOs together and to look at the issues of the SDGs at the national level and how we can hold them accountable. That's it.
Great,
I'm done.
Thank you for that. As Women's Major Group, our mandate isn't with the national level, but I think it's worth perhaps coordinating with the organizing partner for your region and strategizing with the groups who are in your country or at the broader region. And we're happy to provide more information on who that is and which groups we can connect you to help amplify your advocacy work there, if that's helpful. And Shanta is seconding your question, is also asking how can we best make governments accountable? So if anybody has thoughts on enhancing government accountability around these issues, please feel free to hop in.
Well, maybe I could say something about Nigeria. I just looked at the Human Rights Committee website. It's not about the national level, I'm aware of that, but I thought it's maybe useful to use an example. And Nigeria was reviewed by the Human Rights Committee in 2019, which means that the cycle is basically over. So the review has taken place and we are now in this implementation phase in between 2 reviews. And that is really where civil society should be active at the national level, pushing for implementation. And the Human Rights Committee also has a follow-up procedure We have more information about that. If anybody wants to ask me any questions afterwards, please feel free to contact us. And in that follow-up procedure, NGOs or civil society can also submit reports saying more specifically how specific recommendations have been implemented so far in the process. Usually this follow-up takes place about 2 years after the review. And the review took place in August 2019, so this would be August 2021. So for NGOs being active in this field, this would be the time to start preparing your report. And again, it's just very crucial for the Human Rights Committee to receive NGO information so that they can balance this out with the information they receive from states. So we really recommend to use this follow-up procedure. And it is the aspect of the whole review cycle where we see the least NGO engagement. So it is very useful to participate because the committee doesn't always get NGO information. So I would recommend that. I know that it's not specifically about SDGs, but as they are so interlinked, I think it's they basically serve the same goal. So I hope this helps.
Yes.
Sorry, Cecile, your audio is a bit off. Could you try speaking again? I'm not hearing you now.
Do you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead. I don't hear you again, unfortunately. Maybe if you can add your comment in the chat function. It sounds like your audio is going in and out.
I think it's my connector. My connection is very poor. I'm traveling with my phone. Pressure on the.
I think that we've lost her, unfortunately. But okay, it looks like we actually have a lot of really useful resources in the chat function. So maybe we can just save these links and perhaps send them out later, which is really helpful. So thank you all for sharing those. Great. Is there any last comments from anybody? Shanaz, Andrea, others?
Sorry, I just want to say that we'll be saying goodbye to our translators in 2 minutes. So I just wanted to give them a big thank you. It's a very tough process to do this translation. So thank you, all of you so much. And please feel free to leave at past so we don't take from your time. Thank you very much. And all of these resources that you've shared in the chat, thank you all so much. We'll be collecting them and including them in the final report of the webinar, so all our members can access them. Thank you so much. If you remember later any other resources, please feel free to share so we can collate them together if you want. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks for offering translation as well. That's really useful. I'll do one last call for any final comments or questions. Okay, looks like we're good. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and sharing your experiences and resources and all these valuable perspectives. It's really useful to hear from you all on your advocacy in this area and to offer an opportunity for many of us to learn. So thank you. We'll be in touch. And thank you also, Shanaz and Andrea, for setting up the Zoom and everything and facilitating all our work as the Women's Major Group. We'll follow up with all these links and hopefully we can keep in touch and advance our advocacy in this area a bit further. So enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are and have a great weekend and stay safe.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone.